Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the final seminar in our Inside the Human Brain Burnout series. Now, over the last 8 weeks, we've looked at what burnout does to the brain, how it changes thinking, emotions, relationships, memory, decision making, recovery. Today, we're looking at one final question, and that is once the brain begins to recover, how do we reduce the risk of ending up back in the same place again? Now, that's not, of course, about becoming immune to stress. Stress is a predictable part of most of our everyday life. It's about how to protect a recovering and recovered brain. Behavior, of course, makes much more sense, a point we've made previously in the series, when you understand the state of the brain that's producing it and that's receiving it. The idea doesn't just stop once recovery begins. It becomes really important afterwards as we maintain our well-being moving forward. So a lot of people I've spoken to about burnout say pretty much the same thing afterwards. I mean, there's an exploration of how difficult it was, how slow the onset was, and yet how obvious it was in retrospect, and how slow the recovery was. And then, of course, the absolutely normal human anxiety about what happens if it returns. It's an entirely understandable concern. Recovery often restores the brain remarkably well. We've discussed this again. Your brain's capacity to recover its function is quite phenomenal. But recovery isn't the same thing as removing every future source of stress or overload. Feeling better doesn't necessarily mean that the conditions that have contributed to burnout have actually disappeared. And again, that makes perfect sense. Recovery isn't immunity, and this is a really important distinction to make. Your brain, of course, does have this extraordinary capacity to recover attention, memory, the relationships, emotional regulation, but it doesn't confer immunity. Particularly if we return to the exact same pressures, the exact same conditions, the same workload, the same habits, the same expectations, without recognizing them, the natural consequence of that is the same biological processes will gradually begin again. Now, recovery restores function, but it doesn't eliminate future vulnerability. Yes, of course, you may be more aware. You may have developed newer skills. Of course, that's true. But recovery in and of itself does not naturally and wholly confer an immunity to vulnerability in the future. We learned, of course, that, and this would be familiar to you, that burnout appears slowly and insidiously. Of course, its return would predictably follow the same pattern. Just as it developed gradually the first time round, it develops gradually the second time round. Again, it's the small, subtle changes that appear first: feeling mentally tired, patience becoming shorter, concentration slipping, recovery taking longer, activities that you previously enjoyed now feeling like a bit more effort. And they're often early changes rather than signs that burnout has already begun to return. The challenge, of course, in that is that your brain adapts quietly and very slowly alongside the changing demands. So long before you'd say, I'm burnt out, your brain may already be conserving energy to try and meet the demands being placed on it. Attention narrowing, emotions becoming slightly more difficult to deal with and feeling more reactive, habits beginning to replace deliberate, slower, more nuanced thinking. And none of these changes, of course, are dramatic in and of themselves. And actually, they're just normal variants of kind of day-to-day human functioning. And they're often very gradual, that they're difficult to recognize while they're happening. But it's their frequency and their intensity and their coming together that begins to signal to us that burnout is beginning to return. And this is the reason that burnout can often feel like it's returning unexpectedly, even though the brain has been adapting for a long time. They become very, very difficult to notice. However, of course, even what you've experienced already, you may have a heightened sensitivity to the return of these things, as the people around you may also have. What I would consider to be the most important idea from today's seminar is early warnings are not a sign of failure. They're just information. Your brain communicates that demands may once again be exceeding the available resources to you. Now, if you interpret that as weakness, you're likely to ignore these signs. You're likely to see this, if you see it as a weakness, as some kind of moral or personal failure. That, of course, creates more stress and more anxiety and shame and guilt. And that becomes an increasing set of demands on your brain. And that failure to just identify purely as information actually adds to the demands being placed on your brain. And you can just think about it, as difficult as that is in the heat of the moment, essentially like an equation. You see, reducing patience or problems with decision making as evidence that the equation is no longer being matched, that the demands are increasing and that your resources are not matching that. If you interpret those changes as information, they become opportunities then to respond earlier while small adjustments might still be enough. What does the evidence tell us? We look at the scientific literature. You're not going to be surprised by this. There's nothing particularly dramatic jumping out. Protecting recovery is usually about maintaining the same foundations that supported recovery in the first place. And what are they? Protecting sleep, maintaining supportive relationships, keeping your workload realistic where possible, recognizing increasing demands early, and making adjustments before exhaustion becomes overwhelming again. Nothing dramatic. And of course, they don't absolutely guarantee that burnouts won't return. But together, they help reduce the likelihood that chronic overload accumulates quietly in the background, leading to burnout. And something that I often tell people, I think is just really, really useful phrase to keep in your mind. Think in balance, not in perfection. It's one of the greatest ways, I think, to think about brain health in general. It's not about not having stress. It's not about not having demands. Of course, we all want to get on and achieve things, and we have things to do every day. The goal isn't to avoid stress. It's just a normal, natural part of life. Brain health depends not on the absence of stress, but on balance. The meeting of demands with resources. Periods of demand counterbalanced by periods of recovery. Now, that balance, of course, changes continually as we move through life. Some weeks, some days, some months, the demands will be higher. At other times, recovery will naturally dominate. The important thing is to notice when the balance starts shifting for too long in one particular direction. So one simple question, you think about remembering one practical idea from today's seminar, asking yourself this particular question. Has my brain had enough opportunity to recover from what I'm asking it to do? Not yesterday or like last month or right now. Does it have enough in whatever way I resource myself to recover from all the things I'm getting to do? We're very good with this with our bodies generally. With our brains, we expect to just be on all the time and be able to achieve things all the time. Ask yourself, has my brain had enough opportunity to recover from what I'm asking it to do? Simple question, but it encourages you to think about your current brain state rather than simply kind of pushing through, which is often something we demand of ourselves. Of course, that answer will naturally change over time, but it's the question that's important. Looking at the demands that are being placed on you and looking at the conferral of recovery on that particular organ. So the key takeaway, and I'll finish with this final thought. Recovery doesn't end, of course, the day you start to feel better. Recovery is something you continue to support over time. Protecting recovery means recognizing change while it's still small. Remember our equation. Not noticing when demands are beginning to accumulate again. The balance that we talked about of demands and recovery. Once you can develop the capacity or that skill to notice these changes early, you have the opportunity to respond again before your brain becomes completely overwhelmed. You have the opportunity to respond before your brain becomes overwhelmed again. So that takes us to the end of our 9 week series on burnout, the first in the first nine um, seminars in the Inside the Human Brain seminar series. I really appreciate you joining over the last 9 weeks. And my hope always is not just about explaining neuroscience, but it's helping people to recognize things in themselves a little earlier than they otherwise would, and using the evidence and the evidence from neuroscience and behavioral science and psychology to frame that. So if they have helped you understand yourself or understand somebody else a little bit better, then that's an absolute success for us. I really appreciate your time in joining us over lunch over the last 9 weeks. I've really appreciated all the comments, all the questions, all the follows on Instagram, where we're going to be pushing more and more content out that we hope people will find useful. And I hope I can get to see you all again in the future soon. Again, thanks a million. See you soon. Bye bye.